Okay, welcome to our second video on photosynthesis. We're going to go into a little bit more detail this time. So quick review of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis has some things that go into it, are reactants. So the first reactant is going to be carbon dioxide. If you remember that formula, there are 6 carbon dioxide molecules that go into my plant leaf. In addition to carbon dioxide, I have 6 water molecules. So water goes into my plant through the roots, and I also need an energy source, and that energy is going to come from the sun. So 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O and the energy of the sun are my reactants, and it's going to produce something. What it's going to produce is going to be 6 oxygen molecules that will come out of my leaf and a glucose molecule, C6H12O6. So that is a quick overview of photosynthesis. Our reaction, again, is 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus the energy from the sun creates glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. Make sure that you learn this equation, especially this part, the C6H12O6, which is our formula for glucose. Another review of our stomata. So if you remember, we have a leaf, we have the top of our leaf, we have the bottom of our leaf. Inside of our leaf, we're going to have some holes, or actually on the very bottom of my leaf, I have some holes called stomata. And these holes allow carbon dioxide to go into my leaf, and it allows oxygen to come out of my leaf. That process happens through diffusion. So because photosynthesis is ongoing, it is always turning carbon dioxide into that glucose. Because of that, there's always a higher concentration of CO2 outside of my cell than there is inside of my cell. And because diffusion goes from a high concentration to a low concentration, those molecules will keep diffusing in. Likewise, the product of photosynthesis is going to be oxygen. So I will keep producing oxygen molecules inside my cell. And those oxygen molecules will be higher inside of my leaf than outside, and diffusion will occur. It'll go from high concentration to low concentration. So CO2 goes in, O2 comes out, and they go in and out through that hole, the stomata. So quick review of our chloroplast, and hopefully you all finished your chloroplast diagram. So we got some major structures here. We got our membranes. We got the little stacks of green things called my thylakoids, or the actual individual green things are thylakoids. The stacks of them are to be called granum, and then I have some free space in here. The gray areas in this picture are my stroma. It's important to know those areas as we go into more detail about photosynthesis. So there's 2 parts of photosynthesis. There is the first part, light dependent reaction, and the second part, the light independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle. Now, the light dependent reaction happen on my thylakoids. So these green things in here, these stacks of green things, are where my light dependent reactions happen, whereas the second part, the Calvin cycle, happens in my stroma. So the second part happens in that free space next to my granum and thylakoids. So looking at our 2 parts, the light dependent reaction takes the sunlight, the energy from the sun, and it basically splits a water molecule in half, and it uses those hydrogens to produce some chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. So you should be familiar with ATP, since that's our main source of energy in our bodies. And now we're introducing another one called NADPH. This is also where our oxygen is produced, because that remaining oxygen here is produced and it is let out into the atmosphere. So our light-dependent reaction is when we use the energy from the sun to split a water molecule, which results in some energy production and the release of oxygen. Now the second part, the Calvin cycle, is where we take that energy that we made and we use that energy to convert carbon dioxide into a sugar. So this thing that says G3P is basically 1/2 of a glucose. And we'll look at that in a little more detail on some upcoming slides. So let's start with the light-dependent reaction. So the first part is the light-dependent reaction. And this diagram, as you can see, is a real small portion from my thylakoid membrane, or that membrane or structure surrounding my thylakoid. This membrane is just like my plasma membrane. It's made up of the same thing, phospholipids. So here's a phospholipid, here's a phospholipid. You can see it's got my polar head, it's got my 2 fatty acid tails, and it forms that bilayer. It also has a bunch of proteins embedded in it to help things move in and out of that space. So here's green thing here, these are proteins. These purple things are all different types of proteins, including a enzyme. So ATP synthase, which is a very special enzyme that is what makes ATP in our bodies. So looking at our light-dependent reaction, we're going to focus on these 2 green enzymes. They are called photosystems, PS. So we have PS2 and PS1. And these photosystems capture our sunlight. So they are green, and they are what capture the energy from the sun. That sunlight is used to split that water molecule in half, and it produces my oxygen, and it also produces a whole bunch of hydrogen ions. And you could see in this picture there's a whole bunch of hydrogens on the inside of my thylakoid and not as many on the outside. So I have a high concentration on the inside, I have a low concentration on the outside, and because of that, diffusion will occur. So my ions, my hydrogen ions, are going to diffuse through that enzyme, and that enzyme is going to create energy. So every time a hydrogen ion goes from my high concentration on the inside to a low concentration on the outside, ATP is going to be produced. That's important because we're going to use that energy in the next part. You could also see that there's a lot of arrows going on here. This is a pretty complicated process, but what I want you to understand is that when this light comes into photosystem 2, it excites some electrons, and these electrons end up going down an electron transport chain. That chain helps drive ions to the inside, but it also produces something called NADPH. So my electron transport chain, ETC, produces another type of chemical energy called NADPH. So NADPH and ATP are used in the next portion of photosynthesis. Just a quick review, the light-dependent reaction uses energy from the sun to break apart a water molecule and start an electron transport chain. It produces the oxygen that I breathe, and it also produces 2 forms of chemical energy, ATP and NADPH. So here's the second part. This is the Calvin cycle. You can see here in the Calvin cycle that I now have carbon dioxide coming in. In fact, it says 3 of them. So 3 carbon dioxide molecules enter this cycle called the Calvin cycle. And as it goes through this cycle, there's a series of chemical reactions that occur that change it. So this is where my ATP goes in. So this ATP helps change my carbon dioxide into something. and that NADPH will also help change it. It will result in a 3-carbon sugar, which is basically a half of a glucose molecule. Now, if you remember our equation for photosynthesis, what goes in are 6 carbon dioxide molecules. So we need 2 rounds of this Calvin cycle. So that first round happened. Now we're going to have another 3 come in, and it will produce another 3-carbon simple sugar. That will give us 6 carbons. C6H12O6, which is my glucose. So I have now produced a glucose molecule. That's pretty important because that glucose can be used by that plant to make some more ATP energy, or it could be used by that plant as an energy storage in the form of starch, or it could be used to make some structure for the plant in the form of cellulose. That also gives us some food. We are heterotrophs, which means we have to eat other things to get our glucose. So it's a win-win for the plant and for us. Just a quick review. Calvin cycle is turning the energy we made from the light-dependent reaction, which is ATP and NADPH. We're using that energy and turning carbon dioxide into sugar. That sugar is glucose, which is C6H12O6. So here's our overall process of photosynthesis. So we have 2 reactions. We have the light-dependent reaction on this side, and we have the Calvin cycle on this side. So the light-dependent reaction uses the energy from the sun to split a water molecule. That oxygen is then released out into the atmosphere. It gives me something to breathe. And those hydrogen ions start an electron transport chain and produce energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. That energy is used in the next part, the Calvin cycle, to take my carbon dioxide and turn it into sugar or glucose. So carbon dioxide goes in, that energy turns that CO2 into glucose, C6H12O6. That is the complete process of photosynthesis. I hope this makes sense to you guys. If you have any questions, please come see me. Thanks.